How much are you willing to pay to buy American? Just asking questions. In April, Donald Trump unilaterally unleashed a series of so-called reciprocal tariffs, using emergency powers to punish countries with a trade imbalance, meaning they export more to the US than they import from the US. And markets panicked. Trump pulled back, set a new deadline that he's now pushed multiple times. It's now set to expire August 1st. But those aren't the only tariffs Trump has implemented, and there are some signs they may already be driving up some prices. The administration, on the other hand, says the stock market's pretty strong and tariffs are bringing in billions of revenue. American manufacturing is coming back, baby. So, to help us figure out what tariffs might actually do to the US economy, analyze how Trump is using trade as a foreign policy tool, and discuss the ultimate political aims of economic nationalism is Scott Lincicome, VP of Economics and Trade at the Cato Institute and writer of the Capitalism newsletter at the Dispatch. Scott, thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So what are the actual current tariff levels that we have with our major trading partners?
Nobody knows.
Least of all us.
In all seriousness, the reality is that I think you would be really hard pressed to get a consensus from people who study this every day on the exact tariff levels that we have. And in fact, if you look at the various experts, whether it is the Tax Foundation or Yale Budget Lab or the guys at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, they all have slightly different tariff rates for the average tariff that's in effect, because it first of all, it changes constantly. Second is there are all sorts of carve-outs and exclusions and special rules. There's also
hold on, just really fast. Can you give us a few examples of what those might be?
Of the carve-outs?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. So the big reciprocal tariffs had a huge carve out for consumer electronics. They also have carve outs for semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. And the theory of the case there is that the Trump administration has initiated separate investigations of those products under national security, under a different law, Section 232. And so they're going to apply the 232 tariffs eventually to those things. And Trump has threatened 200% pharmaceutical tariffs and those things. So you have a lot of these carve-outs, but you also have additions. So the steel and aluminum tariffs have what's called a derivatives rider, which means that products that are made with a lot of steel and aluminum can also face tariffs based on the amount of steel and aluminum they have in them. And you can petition the government to have your product included on this list of derivatives. Just recently, home appliances were included on the list. Suddenly, those appliances are getting hit with tariffs based on their steel and aluminum content. So if you combine that with some of the rules for automotive goods, what qualifies as a USMCA product and what doesn't, because Trump has these tariffs on fentanyl-related goods, Canada, Mexico, China, but there's a carve-out for Canada and Mexico related to goods that comply with the trade agreement that Trump himself signed, the USMCA. Demonstrating that compliance, I had two customs lawyers giving me two different opinions on what's covered, how easy it is to cover. I get somewhat hilarious, morbidly hilarious emails from customs law firms talking about to clients, trying to get all of this paperwork straight. It's halcyon days. It's boom days for the lawyers and accountants out there. But it's really hard to nail all this down. So this is frustrating for guys like me, but it's also economically important, right? The reality is that if you are in business, importing, exporting, whatever, if you're involved with this stuff and you don't know the exact tariff rate that applies today, tomorrow. You don't know what Trump's going to do next week with some new trade deal that he announces on Truth Social. Planning your business is really hard. Do you front load and try to get all your product in before the tariffs change? Do you wait because you think Trump's going to taco out? Trump always chickens out, right? He's going to, so the tariffs are going to go away. Do you think there are going to be deals that make things better? So forth and so on. So all of that uncertainty means less economic activity, less investment, and the rest. And so we can laugh about it, and it is kind of funny, but it also has real economic harms.
If you're, say, a clothing company and you deal with textiles a lot and you get those textiles from China or Vietnam, Liberation Day was back in April.
Yeah.
Now we're recording this in July, and another round of tariffs will allegedly go into effect on August 1st. The deals that Trump, 90 deals in 90 days that Trump claimed he was going to do. What have these firms been doing? I mean, this is almost an entire quarter. How have they been making these decisions, and what type of impact might this have? Like, say I'm importing all these textiles. How am I making decisions right now?
Yeah, so you have to distinguish in this case between the big firms and the small, because there are really two completely different tracks. For big firms, they're engaging in a lot of creative tariff avoidance schemes. The most obvious one is they front run the tariffs. So when Trump got elected, and in fact, my newsletter tomorrow, there's a great chart in there. You're going to see it. Imports skyrocketed from November through February and into March. And it was all importing companies, a lot of like apparel and retail outlets, but also like pharmaceutical companies and others, just bringing in as much of their product as they can, getting it onshore and stocking it in warehouses to avoid tariffs. The CEO of Levi's in the spring said that they had enough product in country to get them all the way into the fall. So imagine like giant warehouses full of jeans, like in the final scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? It's just like these huge secret warehouses of jeans. But that's what a lot of giant companies did. And that's one of the reasons why we're not seeing tariffs show up so quickly in the price data, is because a lot of companies built up these inventories.
Just real fast, is that a huge gift to Trump that consumers aren't really necessarily fully seeing this right now?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, it's a gift to him in the sense that he can go out there like he and JD Vance and others said and go, aha, the CPI has done nothing, ergo the economists, the elites were wrong. But, again, if you actually read the economists who are talking about this stuff, everybody saw these inventory levels and these import levels rise, and they went, oh, okay, so we're not going to really see major price impact until the fall. So assuming that holds, then Trump's going to kind of get hoisted on this in the fall, to the extent Trump can actually get hoisted on anything, because you will see the price impact. It'll just be delayed, right? So going back to what the companies do. So big companies, they run the tariffs. They adjust their supply chain. So instead of buying from China, you buy from Vietnam, or you buy from India, or whatever. And you buy from Mexico and get that USMCA carve out. So giant companies tend to have multiple suppliers and are pretty nimble. And again, armies of lawyers and accountants to try to figure out how to do this. They do other things. They utilize bonded warehouses and foreign trade zones, all this kind of really creative. One of my favorite examples, Delta Airlines is ripping US-made engines out of its Europe-based jets and bringing them into the country and installing them into grounded US-based planes instead of importing the entire Airbus plane from Europe to avoid tariffs, right? So this is what giant companies can do. And they are doing it. Little guys, they're screwed. Little guys tend to have one supplier. Oftentimes, especially in the case of contract manufacturing in China, it's their product. The contract manufacturer has it's just, it's like basically a big 3D printer in China, and so they have their own merchandise sitting in their own warehouses in China. They have no other options. And well, they don't have the giant warehouses for inventory, and that's it. So I interviewed a guy in a long piece over at Cato. He has a small educational toy company out of Chicago. Employs about 500 people. And when those tariffs hit 140%, he just stopped importing. I asked him, how long can you hold out? And this was again when the tariffs were 140%. He said, I got a couple months maybe, and then that's it. We don't have anything to sell. About 60% of his product came from China. So for the little guys, that's what you're seeing. And you're seeing in the news now, small retailers, particularly e-commerce folks, that are, working on out of Etsy and eBay and Amazon, they're shutting down. And I think that's, those are the types of things when we have these very academic, wonky discussions about what is the CPI reading or whatever. And I'm sure we'll get into that in a sec. But for a lot of, we miss the fact that there are a lot of mom and pop shops that aren't going to show up in the data, and yet are suffering real and in some cases catastrophic harms because they woke up one day and Donald Trump decided that he was going to tax their stuff at 40% or whatever. Even though, when they ordered that product 2 months ago, it was perfectly legit and at zero.
Yeah, I saw. I think this was linked reading one of your articles preparing for this map that J.P. Morgan puts out that estimates the effect that tariffs have on these mid-size, what they classify as mid-size firms.
Right.
And you can see when that April 2nd announcement, full universal tariffs went into effect, kind of the darkening of the color there, like how sensitive these mid-size firms really are to this stuff in a way that the big guys aren't. It kind of reminds me in a weird way, parallel to like the COVID era when we had lockdowns and it was like the big box stores that got exemptions or were just otherwise able to adapt in a way that the small ones weren't.
Yeah, and that's actually another important point. The big guys also have armies of lobbyists who can go to Washington, or the CEOs themselves, good old Tim Apple can go sit and have dinner with Trump, and then boom, exemption for consumer electronics, right?
Yeah.
The little guys, the toy guy I mentioned, he doesn't have that clout. So if you look at all of the lawsuits against the Trump tariffs, they are all small businesses. They're not the big guys. And I think that is a reflection of this economic reality. And I think a bit of the politics of it as well, that the big companies don't want to have targets on their backs.
Yeah.
Well, to that point, as you were talking and talking about Tim Apple going to Washington, I was thinking about how Jeff Bezos sort of attempted to be the hashtag resistance, at least when it comes to tariffs, and basically say, hey, we are going to have a policy where we attempt to convey to consumers that we're just not arbitrarily rising prices.
Right.
Here's the impact that tariffs are having on each, specific good. And we might not be able to do it fully across the board, but we'll at least be able to give consumers some sense of this. We're not happy about passing these costs on to them, but we do have to some degree. Right. And then immediately got called into a meeting with Trump and with White House officials. And I mean, that policy of Amazon's was what changed within 2 hours, 3 hours. It was something crazy. And so at least I'm beginning to be worried because I like this idea of these big firms being, they have this political influence that they can exercise, but they also have a certain sturdiness that makes it so that normal consumers aren't necessarily going to feel this. They're a bulwark against normal consumers feeling this until later in the game. Yeah. And yet the biggest player in the entire e-commerce game, Jeff Bezos, was kind of strong-armed into compliance. What do you make of that? Do you think we're just going to see more of that dynamic?
I think so, unfortunately. There's a few things going on. First is basically political, right? The famous Michael Jordan quote, "Republicans buy shoes too," it applies. Tariffs are a political thing. If you look at the polling on tariff, it is so depressing as a wonk because support for tariffs is so partisan now. Democrats now hate them. Republicans now love them. 10 years ago, it was exactly the opposite. And when Biden started talking up tariffs, then Democrats kind of changed their tune a little bit. Well, but what does that mean? So if you're a big retailer like Amazon or Walmart, and you're out there bad-mouthing tariffs, well, you're effectively insulting half of your customer base, or in Walmart's case, maybe more than half your customer base, right? The other issue is you will be attacked by inarguably the world's loudest person, and his armies of fervent followers. So that's another thing to think about. But then there's also an economic issue. Consumers don't like increased prices regardless of how they come about. And as libertarians and wonky folks, we're like, oh no, this is the tax. It's not their fault. It's the government's passing that on. Individuals aren't that rational most of the time. And so companies don't like to telegraph price hikes, even if it's the government's fault, if their competitors aren't doing the same. And so we're in a bit of a prisoner's dilemma on price hikes. And that's why you combine all this together. And, we had this brief spurt of companies blaming tariffs for price hikes. And then all of the shizzle hit the fan. And suddenly now there's a lot of price hikes announcement in the news, but they're blamed on market conditions,
right?
And CEOs don't mention tariffs in their investor calls, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that the price hikes aren't happening, but they're avoiding that kind of target and blame.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I agree with Liz. I liked that brief moment where there was a little bit of transparency, and it's like like when you live in a county and go to the store, you get the sales tax separated out. There's something nice about that from a libertarian perspective, and I wish
totally
it was across the
agree.
board. Yeah,
and states have it for gas taxes. On the gas pump, there's a gas tax thing. I like it too. I think there is a untapped market for tariff trackers, like a Chrome plugin that looks back at a product's price history and says, well, on January 20th, this product cost this much, and today it costs this much. Draw your own conclusions.
I've been doing this with Lululemon leggings. This is a very girly way of thinking about tariffs, but I consider it my Lululemon legging price index, but where I'm just like tracking the price of this one particular sort of classic, iconic Lululemon style. They're already expensive pants, but holy cow, if they go up, by 20, 30%, not a single gal in all of New York City can afford them.
The dude version of that is the Nintendo Switch 2, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Well, two things. First, Liz, you need to be buying the Costco knockoffs before Lulu sues them out of existence.
This is service journalism. Thank you, Scott.
Second, maybe more on topic. I actually did the same thing because I was in the market for a car, and because my old beater was literally leaking out of the sunroof, and I couldn't even move the seat anymore. So I was price tracking a certain car for a long time, and I got to watch depressingly the price spike right after the auto tariffs were announced, and there's this big rush. But I also got to see some of the consumer enthusiasm drop, and then the price kind of came back down. So there are things that, like, if you track this stuff, you can actually see the news in your own personal price tracking.
My husband keeps getting mad at me because he thinks I'm online shopping, and I'm like, no. I'm thinking about tariffs. Don't worry.
Research. Yeah. So
a likely excuse.
You mentioned like the way that now Democrats have started to talk about this. Like now it's kind of flipped, and now Democrats are against tariffs.
Yeah.
And there's people like even like Elizabeth Warren talking this game of like, oh yeah, what we've been saying all along, that when you tax a business, it gets passed on to the buyer. We actually have a clip of her making that case. Can you roll that clip, John?
Some of his CEO buddies are already lining up to pass along costs to American families, or to ask Trump for special exemptions for themselves. If this sounds to you like chaos, that's because it is. And if you've turned on the news today, you can see just how badly it's going for our economy. What Trump is doing means that businesses will seize up and pull back on their investments. Americans' confidence in our economy will drop even lower. And companies are already talking about using this chaos as cover to raise their own prices even more. So they protect their profits, but your costs go up. And now your next pair of shoes may not cost $50, it may cost $100.
So she's framing it in that very Elizabeth Warren-esque way
Yeah.
of, this is still kind of a conspiracy of the greedy profiteers
corporations.
just protecting their corporations, protecting their profits. But she is acknowledging that this is the effect. Do you see that as a positive development or step in the right direction?
Yeah, I do. In fact, I wrote a column talking about how Democrats are suddenly sounding like libertarians because the arguments that Liz Warren just made there are almost identical to the ones that free marketers make with respect to, say, corporate taxes, right? That it's not corporations paying the taxes, it's consumers and workers and investors. And so to hear her sounding libertarian-ish is nice. Now, I'm not crazy enough to think that Elizabeth Warren is now a dedicated supply-side free marketer. But it is good that type of thinking, kind of that second order effects type thinking about taxes and uncertainty and the rest are those discussions are happening on the left. And I mean, and Warren, of course, is kind of the populist pretty far left. I think the even more optimistic thing is that moderate Democrats really seem to have had an awakening of sorts on this stuff. And it really is not, this is not a partisan thing. When I talk to self-identified, kind of Obama neoliberal types, I mean, they're like, this stuff is crazy. And they were like this when Biden was in office, raising tariffs too. That's nice to see. But again, I do think.
But hold on. So that implies that there might actually be something more enduring beyond a pure partisan flip. Because when 100%. I hear Warren there talking about it, it's kind of like the way she frames it, it's still like leaves her room to just go back to the idea that it's just the greedy corporations, right. like the whole greedflation thing that was going on during the Biden era. Yeah.
And I mean, I don't have a lot of hope for Senator Warren.
Yeah.
But I do think there is a big chunk of the Democratic Party that has had an actual shift that is not just an anti-Trump reflex. We do a lot of work on the Hill at Cato. I talk to a lot of staffers and a lot of members, and I in fact asked this exact question. I said, how much of this is really just anti-Trump stuff, and how much is it actual, a change in either your personal policy views or your base, right? Because the Democratic base is shifting a bit, and the staffer said, I got to be honest, about half and half. So, but look, I'll take half, right? Because
right.
I cut my teeth in trade policy during the late 90s and 2000s when Congress was Democratic Congress was 90-10 pro-protectionist. You had a few, but Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, most folks in the Democratic caucus were anti-trade. FTAs back then were passed by Republicans with a handful of Democratic votes. It does seem that there is a better split these days on that side. Now, of course, the depressing side is on the Republican Party. You've seen the opposite. Now, I don't think the Republicans in Congress are 90-10 against trade and pro-tariff. But as long as Trump's running the show, that doesn't matter much. We have good outreach with Republican offices on the Hill about this stuff, but like coming out publicly and voting against Trump, that's Let's face it. We know
That
that's
that
pretty.
turns you into Thomas Massey, and you just get a million Truth Social posts about you, and a
Right.
primary
Right.
opponent
Yeah. And you get
funded. Yeah,
primaried and you're out of a job.
yeah,
And for what? Right.
yeah.
Because
Well,
there is a, when it comes to Congress, you always have to remember that Congress has already delegated so much tariff power to the president. Because of course, Congress has the constitutional authority over tariffs and trade under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, but they gave it all to the president. Probably too much, and that's probably going to go to the Supreme Court.
mhm.
But so to get that power back, and this is why you shouldn't delegate it in the first place, is you need veto-proof majorities. So for Republicans, the calculus is pretty straightforward. Unless you are an uber principled guy like Rand Paul, I mean, what's the point of casting some random vote that goes nowhere and then losing your job in 2 or 4 years?
Why exactly? I mean, this is pretty in the weeds, but why exactly did Congress abrogate their role here? And when did that happen?
Yes, it happened about 75 or now 85 years ago. So basically, Smoot-Hawley, as we all know from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, was the last major tariff bill that Congress implemented. Because Congress used to pass these tariff bills, and they were pretty corrupt messes. And there's some great, if you're into this stuff, there's some great books that document just how seedy tariff politics was. It was really kind of one of the original smoke-filled room cronyism policy industries, and created a lot of our modern lobbying system today. So Congress realized following Smoot-Hawley and 2 world wars that had trade angles to them, not caused by trade, but had rival trading blocks and stuff. Congress realized can't really be trusted with all this tariff power. And there's a foreign policy interest in a generally more open and non-discriminatory trading system where countries weren't getting into rival trading blocks and cutting each other off, because that creates foreign policy and problems, maybe even wars. So Congress delegated to the president 2 big powers. 1, the ability to go negotiate trade agreements. 2, tariff powers. So over a series of laws, as Congress was lowering tariffs generally through trade agreements, they didn't want to just not have the ability, they didn't want to take away the government's ability to raise tariffs for national security reasons or whatever. So they gave that power to the president. And we have, I believe, 5, 6 laws on the books that are pretty darn open-ended when it comes to the president unilaterally imposing rather large and broad tariffs. The biggest one is the one that's now being litigated, the one behind the reciprocal tariffs and the fentanyl tariffs, and that's the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which doesn't even mention tariffs, but it's so broad that Trump has used it for all this stuff. I mean, it's like a tariff switch in the Oval Office. And until the courts say that he can't do that, or that the law is an unconstitutional delegation, we're stuck with it. But even if the Supreme Court were to overrule it, we have to remember that there are other laws out there that he could use to eventually get to almost the same place.
Yeah, so that is, Trump is using these tariffs not only as because he believes in the economics of tariffs and onshoring manufacturing, but as this foreign policy tool that you're describing there.
Right.
And that is partly what so one of the big developments in the negotiations apparently is that he wants to slap the EU with, I believe it was a 30% tariff.
Yeah.
And the rationale for that was to get them to remove barriers that were both tariff and non-tariff policies and trade barriers. You need to fix those, Europe. Otherwise, you're getting a 30% tariff for creating imbalanced trade. Like, as a foreign policy objective, like, how legitimate do you see that as, and how realistic a demand is it from Trump?
Yeah, I don't see much of a real foreign policy angle here, and I don't see eliminating trade balances with tariffs as an economically realistic thing. The reality is, most economists will tell you that the United States trade balance is driven by big macroeconomic things, savings and investment overall. It's not driven by trade policy. Trade policy can affect it at the margins, but in general, U.S. runs a trade deficit because Americans spend more than they save, including the federal government, by the way. And if you apply tariffs, you're going to reduce imports, but you're also going to reduce exports. And at the end of the day, you end up in the same place. Economists are even more pessimistic about bilateral trade balances, just there, especially because there are more than two countries in the world and supply chains are pretty complicated. Just is not a good way to achieve. Tariffs aren't a good way to achieve that goal. But they are a painful weapon for Trump, because yes, tariffs first effects are for us as American consumers, but they do also harm foreign exporters, right? If you jack up the effective price of an import, that the foreign producer is going to lose sales in the importing market, either because there are just fewer people buying it or because an American company is going to start gaining market share, right? So Trump has this tool and he likes to throw it around and he likes to pretend that it's about foreign trade barriers and all this stuff. But the reality is it's increasingly clear that it's just an excuse for Trump to raise tariffs. The deals with Vietnam. Well, let's start with the UK. The United States barely got any sort of reductions in English trade barriers, whatever they might be, tariff or non-tariff. But at the same time, the United States didn't really give products from the UK much preference there either. There's a little bit on aircraft and a little bit for autos, but nothing too major. Most of the tariffs Trump imposed unilaterally remained. And now we have these new deals with Vietnam, supposedly. We still haven't seen that text, and Indonesia, supposedly. But in that case, the United States is maintaining tariffs of around 20%. And those governments are lowering some tariffs, but we don't know exactly what. Trump says they're going to zero, but we need to wait and see the details. But so what we're really getting out of these deals is not true free trade, as some in Trump's orbit have argued. We're just getting a mercantilist setup, right? Where we get high US barriers, slightly lower or foreign barriers, and a still quite restricted trade overall. And that's the reality. My working thesis on all of this has for a long time been Trump just likes tariffs. He thinks they're great. He thinks they're a great economic tool. He thinks they're a great way to get very powerful people to run to the White House and ask him for stuff. And he thinks they're a great way to, keep the Trump show running in the media. And, you put all that together, and it's a recipe for just constant tariff stuff.
I'm like 90% in agreement there. And then 10% of me is just a contrarian, or I want to steel man the sort of Trump defender case, which is like, is there a level at which, the tariffs on US goods that are coming into other countries could be reduced to a point where the fact that Trump has basically started all of these trade wars and escalated them, like if
like
the
tariff our way to free trade is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I don't think we've seen that so far, but we are actually, in some countries, I think Indonesia might have been a good example of this that was in the news this week, seeing a little bit of a reduction. Is there a case you made there?
So yes and no. I do think it is worthwhile that, and it's a point for Trump that these tariff threats seem to have gotten these governments to reduce their trade barriers on U.S. exports.
Yeah, to re-examine the barriers that they were imposing. Yeah,
right.
exactly.
But this is, first of all, in a country like Vietnam, which is also apparently offered to lower its trade barriers. Vietnam wanted that for a long time. Vietnam was a member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the United States used to be a member of, and which would have eliminated 99+% of Vietnamese tariffs and non-tariff barriers on everything from the United States, and done in a much more comprehensive and coherent and transparent way. And so Indonesia is a different case. It's a very tiny market. I guess prying it open, there are a lot of people there, and that's a good thing. But is it economically significant? And then the big problem, though, the bigger problem is that this is going to be bad for the United States. We are going to keep tariffs on, and very high tariffs on, things from Vietnam and Indonesia and anywhere else. And import tariffs mean fewer exports. I know that's hard to wrap your head around, but a tax on imports is a tax on exports. We call it learner symmetry, but the basic idea is that whether it is through higher input costs or currency changes or other wonky economic things, when you increase import tariffs, you tend to reduce exports. So even though these countries are lowering some barriers, because we're going to maintain high import barriers, we shouldn't expect a supercharged export industry.
Also, another knock-on effect that I keep thinking about is like, how are foreign exporters changing their behavior vis-a-vis the US and their future plans, right? Like that's another component that continues to bother me.
So that's another thing that we have to consider in all of this, is it's not just about the United States and the other country. It's about the other country and all the other countries. Because what you've seen over the last few years, because, Biden wasn't a big free trader. He wasn't doing anything on trade agreements. What you've seen over the last few years is governments just doing free trade deals with each other and leaving the United States out of it. And I think that that's going to be the kind of end game for all of this. Is the United States is going to have a pretty high unilateral tariff wall in place, and other governments and countries and their people are going to be trading more freely with each other and just leaving us out of it.
That makes a lot of sense. So one of the weirdest developments so far in all of the tariff drama has been Trump's threats against Brazil, basically threatening Brazil with 50% tariffs for what he claims is a witch hunt domestically against Jair Bolsonaro, and secret and unlawful censorship orders to U.S. social media platforms handed down by the Brazilian courts. The U.S. has a trade surplus with Brazil.
Yeah.
So this is just pure politics. This isn't even about the trade imbalance that Trump is so bothered by. To me, this feels like, Trump has already given us 5-6 different excuses for what he's trying, 5 or 6 different justifications for what he's trying to accomplish with tariffs. But to me, this looks a lot like punishing political adversaries and being pissed off by what's going on domestically inside of Brazil. What do you think about Trump, using tariffs in this way? Is this a new front that's been opened up?
Yeah. In one sense, I love it, because it is just such an egregious and clear example of why the law under which all this is happening, the IEPA, needs to be ruled unconstitutional and eliminated from our corpus. The reality is that if the president of the United States can threaten 50% tariffs on Brazil for what are clearly their own domestic political issues, then that law is the law under which he's doing all of this is just totally bogus, right? And it's just so indefensible. You're not going to find anybody who even supports Trump who's like, oh yeah, that's clearly a great use for tariffs. And I'm hoping that the courts that are ruling on this stuff will if they don't expressly pay attention to it, will at least implicitly pay attention to it. That said, in the meantime, it's troubling, right? That, could you imagine a situation where a foreign government tried something like this related to a US court case? I mean, we would lose our minds rightly over this, right? And so that type of interference, using that type of economic coercion for something so nakedly personal and political is really messed up.
I also haven't looked too deeply into this, but I know one major Brazilian import to the US is like meat, for example. And so I'm curious about Trump and Tucker Carlson and all these right-wing types who are so pissed off by people switching to meat alternatives. It's like, well, you might have just jacked up the price of meat because you're worried about Brazilian courts attempting to hold Bolsonaro accountable for his attempted coup. Like, really, consider that.
Yeah, and coffee, that's the one I'm worried about. As a caffeine addict who gets the jitters if he doesn't have a calf in a couple hours, I'm extremely displeased.
Pivot to cocaine, I guess.
No, that's somebody actually made a great point. This is a huge win for coke dealers across the United States.
Markets are thriving. They don't have to deal with
substitution effects, right? So here we go. The other thing I read, very hilarious, is there's apparently some coffee alternative made in Texas called like Yaupon or something, and I'm like, oh gosh. So now we're going to create like a domestic Yaupon industry that is going to lobby to maintain the Brazilian tariffs because it now has jobs are on the line. It's like going to become our next ethanol.
This is going to be our Delta THC for coffee.
Right.
Whatever.
Right.
So,
we're going to march on Washington to keep the Yaupon jobs.
Guys, we're libertarians. We welcome competition. We welcome Delta
market. The market has spoken on this. I'm sorry. Coffee, Yaupon. This has been around for a long time. Coffee wins. Yeah. It's over.
So, speaking of prices, I did want to dig a little bit into the data here because it's still somewhat early days and we're trying to read the tea leaves to some degree, but the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, did just release the latest consumer price index, which I'm going to pull up here. And it's one that I've annotated with Trump's various some of Trump's various tariffs along the way with these red lines. So you can kind of see, okay, here's where the tariffs were, and here's how the blue line is all items, the red line is all items plus energy, and what we're looking at is the 12-month percent change in basically prices for urban consumers during that time period. Here's a more simple, cleaner version that just shows like Trump's first tariff action there with the red line. And then I always like to zoom out so everyone can get the full context here. So this is the core inflation rate over the past 10 years. And you see that huge spike during COVID era up. I think it got upward around 7% there. Now in June at the end there, you see the slight uptick. We're approaching 3%. I guess my question about all that, my first question is, how much do you think tariffs are contributing to that uptick, that little uptick there at the end?
Yeah. In fact, my column this week is on tariffs and inflation and this whole issue, because if you talk to Trump supporters, if you listen to the president, JD Vance was out today talking about it. They always go, oh, look at the CPI or the PPI, or clearly that's the producer price index. Clearly tariffs don't raise prices or cause inflation, right? And economists go, well, wait a second. Nobody in the economics profession or people who study this say tariffs cause inflation as we understand the term, because inflation is a persistent increase in the rate of change of producer prices or of consumer prices. So it's 3% over a long period, 4%, whatever. Well, that's not how tariffs work. Tariffs are more of a one-off increase in the price level. So you're going to see, if it was a very clean, simple system, you would basically see prices just jump up and then continue doing whatever they were doing, because inflation, technically properly understood, is driven by monetary and fiscal policy. It's not driven by things like tariffs, which is a bit counterintuitive, but that's the reality. So what we're waiting to see is this one-off spike, right? This one-time increase.
Yeah.
Now, in the real world, of course, and especially in Trump's world, Trump didn't just say, boom, 20% global tariff. He's done it in fits and starts and stops and deals and non-deals and retaliation and carve-outs. And so at the end of the day, what most economists think we're going to see is a gradual increase in the CPI or in the personal consumption expenditures, which is what the Fed likes to look at, where it'll peak at somewhere around 3 or whatever, 3.5, and then start heading down again. Because again, this is assuming no major changes in monetary or fiscal policy. So it'll go up and then it'll go down. Now, the question is when. And that's where you have to get into the weeds, because another reason why all of this gloating from Trump and Vance and others about CPI is why it's nonsense, is that, well, like we already discussed, companies have been doing a lot of stuff to avoid an immediate tariff hit. Mainly, again, front running the tariffs, importing tons of stuff, boosting inventories. So that, and along with a lot of other things, creates a lag between the time the tariffs are announced and the time you would expect to see things show up in the CPI. Another issue is that companies might not pass on all of the tariff costs, right? We talked about whether it's for reputational reasons or political reasons or economic reasons or whatever, they're going to eat some of the tariff, and that's going to be like a corporate tax, right? They're going to pass it on through their shareholders, or they're going to just hire less or invest less or pay lower wages or whatever. It'll never show up in the CPI. It's just going to be a corporate tax. And then there are the potential for tariffs not to show up where foreign companies do eat some of the tariff. That's Trump's favorite defense, right? Foreigners are going to pay these tariffs. Well, Goldman Sachs looked at this. They said, actually, foreigners are only eating about 20% maybe of the tariff cost, which is more than last time, but it's still, it leaves 80% in the United States. So there's some of that too. And then finally, of course, a lot of stuff we consume are services, healthcare, housing, and other things that are only indirectly affected by tariffs. And these are things that, again, they won't show up in the CPI data, at least not quickly, if at all. So you put it all together, and there's absolutely no reason to think that the CPI of yesterday, this week, which is the June CPI, should be showing a major inflationary spike, and certainly not something that's going to just be inflationary forever. And so that said, you noted that little uptick. If you actually dig into the numbers for June, you start to actually see tariff effects. So a bunch of economists have dug into this. There's some great charts on Twitter. And what you can see is for tariff affected goods, appliances, toys.
I've got some of that data here, actually. I did dig into it, and I'm going to pull it up and ask you what it means. So if you scroll down in that report they put out, you can see they break out exactly how much have goods increased in price over this time period. And we're looking at the time period from last month, May 2025 to June 2025. And I just went through and highlighted things that were 2% or above. And so what we see here are beef and veal. Back to Liz's point, if we tariff Brazil, that might get higher. About 45% of beef is produced domestically. The rest is imported, the beef that we consume. Eggs have gone down. That's the big point of pride for the Trump administration, since egg prices were famously high during the Biden era. They have egg prices have gone down 7.4%. But continuing with things that have increased, some fruits like oranges and other fresh vegetables, Non-frozen juices and drinks, coffee, you mentioned 2.2%, instant coffee, interestingly, 5.1%. I don't know what's going on there. Peanut butter, 2.2%, olives, pickles, and relishes, which is some of my favorite stuff, 4.9%. Food at employee sites, window and floor coverings. You mentioned appliances are all hovering around 2% increase, and then non-electric cookware and tableware.
Yeah.
So what is, digging a little further like
Yeah.
this?
So
What jumps out to you?
Well, what jumps out to me are things like appliances and floor coverings and that type of stuff. So these are goods that are, so food is pretty volatile. So meat prices, egg prices, that kind of stuff. That you look at a bit skeptically, other than coffee, because coffee is a pretty clear one where it's you're going to get some tariff effects, but also again global kind of market effects.
Yeah.
It's more in the durable goods stuff and the apparel, textiles, footwear, appliances, cookware. You named it. Construction materials is another one where we're apparently seeing some frothiness, and that's where you are starting to see tariff effects now. Just again, to be clear, and this is where I think all these inflation talking points from the administration are so bogus, is a standard inflation theory. Standard economics will say, if you spend more on furniture, appliances, and food or whatever else because of tariffs, if there isn't a change in monetary or fiscal policy, you're going to have to spend less on other stuff. That means less demand for that other stuff, and prices of that other stuff, those services and the rest, will actually go down. And so you would not see a change in the overall CPI, even though the spending on each would change and their price levels have changed. Some would go up, some would go down. And that's a lot of what we're seeing right now. The biggest decline, so we had the producer price index out today. That's what companies pay. The biggest declines were in services, the stuff that were not subjecting tariff. We saw a big increase in goods, the things that are subject to tariffs. Now, imports aren't included in the PPI, but domestic and imported goods travel pretty much in tandem, contrary again to what some protectionists might tell you. And this is pretty textbook stuff. And if you go back to the CPI report and you look at the areas where there are where you would expect to see some inflationary, I shouldn't say that term.
Yeah, just
some
price rises.
Price effects, right? Thank you. You're starting to see it. And most everybody expects more of that to come.
Yeah. By the way, I think it's it seems like a technical point, but it is an important one. This idea, and it's one that libertarians are kind of sticklers about. The idea, Milton Friedman famously put it that inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. And at least we're saying that when it persists, like you're saying, it comes from fiscal and monetary policy. So we're talking about prices going up, and that is what we're trying to get to the bottom of here.
Exactly. And I think it's a really important political point, because the administration is trying to wave away the tariffs because the CPI hasn't bulged.
Right.
But that distracts from the real effects of the tariffs. And what tariffs' real effects are not inflationary. It's they make us poorer. Right. Because going back to my example, if you have to spend more on food, clothing, and other tariffed goods, and thus you spend less on housing and healthcare and other things, right? You are materially worse off than you were before the tariff. You have less stuff that you're consuming overall. You're worse off. You are poorer. That's how tariffs work.
This was a kind of a concerning trend line that I came across here. Was it looks at U.S. year-over-year real disposable personal income and spending, and so that's how much you have saved and how much are you willing to spend, and that we've seen a pretty persistent. There's some positive indications in the economy that we're going to talk about in a second, but that is one that it should be fairly concerning, I would think, if you're talking about tariffing consumer goods,
Yeah.
the amount of actual consumption expenditure. But I want to ask you a little to zoom in on JD Vance's point. He was as you mentioned, he was gloating a little bit about
Yeah.
some of this data. Specifically, I think it was the PPI,
Yes.
which is it's not consumer prices, it is basically the wholesale prices that
it's what producers pay.
Yes, thank you. So what we've seen there, I'm going to pull up just a headline from Market Watch that I think puts it well. Wholesale prices are flat in June, PPI shows, and point to muted effects of tariffs on inflation. This is what JD Vance is saying, is that, this is, if anything, a leading indicator that prices are going to go down if the inputs at the wholesale level are lower. All the economists were wrong,
Right.
and tariffs are not going to drive up your prices.
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
Yeah, so there's two big problems with that. And big shout out to the economist Ernie Tedeschi, who's now with the Yale Budget Lab. He had a great thread on Twitter on this today that hit the two big points. The first point is that PPI does not include imports. So even though you expect domestic prices to track higher import prices, it is weird to talk about tariffs and the PPI and kind of on that basic point. The more important point is that, as Ernie shows, you actually are seeing exactly what you'd expect. Goods prices increasing, services prices decreasing. Goods prices, of course, are the things that are going to be affected directly and immediately or more quickly by tariffs. Services are, again, assuming a consistent monetary and fiscal situation, what you would expect to see decline. And it's precisely what we've seen. So the fact that some professional forecasters got their prediction wrong of the overall level doesn't change the what's under the hood, right? And what's under the hood are pretty much what you'd expect. Again, giving the delays and lags and all that other wonky stuff I already talked about.
So Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, said at a cabinet meeting that the government might take in $300 billion in tariff revenue this year. The Treasury basically reports more than $100 billion so far, which is the greatest amount that's ever been raised through tariffs. I believe in the past it's roughly $50 billion a year is sort of the general standard. You can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. So we're already double a sort of standard year. And this is 5% of all tax receipts for the month in June. And it actually has generated a budget surplus for the month, which is all very uncomfortable for libertarians, right?
Yeah.
But there's been this plan offered by, Team Trump all along, which has been basically, slash personal income taxes, try to cut income taxes to the greatest degree possible. And then the way we're going to fund the federal government is through tariffs, tariffing the heck out of people.
Yeah.
First of all, is this desirable from a libertarian standpoint? Like, is there any world in which that would be desirable? And two, if that is their sort of stated goal, are they kind of doing it? In fact?
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, but let's start with the budget surplus. That was fake. A statistical anomaly due to the monthly reporting. We get a lot of money in for the month, and it just happened. But if you look over the actual last year,
headline number, but not really. That should not be people's takeaway.
Right. If you look, because you have to look over a 12-month period, we're still in a massive hole. There is no forthcoming. We're not going to wake up a year from now and be like, wow, we have a magic budget surplus. We had a magic budget surplus for the last year. You get it for 1 month, and then it gets consumed by deficits for the rest of the year.
As a girl who struggles with her budgeting, as I've already mentioned in this podcast, let them have this one. Damn it.
No, I refuse. There are bigger problems, though. The first, as we already said, is that even assuming a rather optimistic take on foreigners paying some of the tariff costs by lowering their prices, you're still looking at the vast majority of those billions coming from American companies and consumers. So this is just taxing, it's just a new tax, just new tax revenue being paid mainly by Americans. So let's say 300 billion, 80% of that is coming from Americans. We just are celebrating a $240 billion tax increase that, of course, was implemented unilaterally by the president without any input from Congress or various businesses, you name it. It just was slapped on there for whatever reason. So that's.
But I mean, but hold on, it was the latest bill that just passed is reducing other taxes. It's reducing certain income taxes and
I'm
corporate
making
taxes.
it like a bandit with salt
So
deductions,
is
right?
is the swap actually beneficial?
Well, so you're certainly going to get some benefit from the tax cuts, but the people hurt most by tariffs are the poor. The poor pay the most of their disposable income towards tradable goods, and thus tariffs are a very regressive tax. The biggest tax cuts were, and the poor don't pay any income taxes, right? So leaving aside the taxes on tips and Social Security, that gets really off the reservation. In general, swapping into income tax cuts for tariff hikes is going to be very regressive. So it's going to be good for wealthy folks. They're going to act, they win. It's going to not be so good for poorer folks who weren't paying much income tax and are going to be paying tariffs via higher consumer prices. So that's
But hold on, isn't this part of some people's argument against the flat tax, which Rand Paul has historically been into and lots of libertarians have advocated?
Well, yes and no. So if tariffs were a flat consumption tax, then you could make that argument, but they're not. So tariffs are a really narrow tax that isn't actually on end consumption, and it gets distorted all through the supply chain in all the ways we talked about. It's also a very narrow tax base. Imported goods are only roughly 10 to 15% of all of our consumption. So there's this 85% that's not getting taxed at all. That creates all sorts of distortions in how we spend our money, how businesses do their business, and it funnels economic activity towards less efficient enterprises. So put more simply, an ideal tax is going to be really flat, so no carve outs, very broad tax base at a very low rate. And that's going to and be very transparent. You're going to know what you get. You're going to know what you're going to get into in advance. Tariffs check off 0 of those boxes. Okay. They're not transparent. They're applied at the border and then filtered through all these supply chains. They're also matched by price hikes by domestic businesses. So they're kind of this invisible tax that consumers pay, but doesn't actually end up in the treasury at all. They have a very narrow tax base, and to raise a lot of revenue, they have to be very high, and that's going to be very distortionary for economic activity. So as a pure tax policy, tariffs are terrible for that. You're not going to find any tax wonks that are like, this is the great way to fund the government. And then the final problem is that 300 billion is a drop in the bucket for federal spending. It wouldn't cover a single major part of the budget. It wouldn't even cover the interest on the debt these days, right? So it's, if you celebrate, I'm not one to really celebrate, yay, we're getting more tax revenue, but even as a simple paying in the budget situation, it's not raising that much money. You still have to deal with spending. You still have to deal with entitlements and all these other things that nobody wants to touch. The big, beautiful bill didn't touch, other than a tiny bit on things like Medicaid. And so we're still in a giant hole, and we're just collecting money in a much less efficient way than like a flat income tax or a flat consumption tax.
Okay, but is there any credence to this idea that obviously, we saw initial stock market turbulence from Liberation Day, which liberated so many of us from our stock portfolios and any assurance of a healthy, decent retirement. But, so we saw stock market turbulence then. It has in many ways recovered since then, which is huge. But, now we're seeing markets react somewhat favorably, maybe not specifically to the sort of weird patchwork that's cascaded upon us of tariffs, but this mixture of things, the domestic policy bill passing, the fact that there are some income tax cuts, which end up, ultimately going to the upper middle class and the rich. But still, I mean, we haven't seen market bloodbath.
Right. No,
Is this looking like there's some secret sauce in the Trump economy where like all of us are looking a little foolish right now? And it very well could be the case that several months from now, we're all vindicated. But, is there anything to the Trump defenders' defense that like, actually it's not nearly as bad as the sky is falling chicken little folks were claiming?
Yeah, no, and I think that that's exactly the right way to put it. It's not as bad as some of the catastrophic rhetoric, fortunately not for me. And it's not as bad as investors' worst fears because, I think part of what the Liberation Day sell-off was a worst case scenario situation. Extremely high tariffs that Trump has since walked back. I mean, yes, 10 to 20% is still very high historically, but it's much lower than the 40 or 50% that was being threatened on Liberation Day. More muted foreign retaliation, foreign governments that have actually been kind of smart about not butchering their own economies with their own retaliatory tariffs. And some of it is about simply expectations. Trump has, to his credit, brilliantly, whether intentionally or not, moved the Overton windows so far into tariff crazy town that now when he's pulling back on that, markets are like, yay, that's a win, right? Because it's not the worst that they were expecting. And markets are very much about what's coming, not what's past. But there was other, I think, bigger points. And this is something I'm glad I have stressed on Twitter and on other podcasts and writing, is that we always need to remember the United States is a massive $30 trillion economy that is mainly fueled by services industries. Most of those are not directly affected by trade policy, and particularly not goods tariffs. And we have a lot of tailwinds, not just the general strength of the U.S. economy, which has been pretty strong for a while, but we have a very dynamic and flexible economy that can take some punches and keep rolling. We have tailwinds from AI. I mean, this massive AI boom that everybody keeps expecting. The Trump administration is enacting some good policy, whether it's energy deregulation or the excellent full expensing that the big, beautiful bill put in, allowing immediate deduction of business investments. These are good policies. So you put this all together, and it makes sense that the stocks are not tanking. Now, does that mean it's good policy? No, it just, the way I have often described it is, I mean, I can cut off my pinky and still live a pretty normal life. That doesn't mean cutting off my pinky was a good idea. It just means it wasn't catastrophic, right? It didn't kill me. You don't celebrate your amputated pinky. And that's important to remember, because it really is a lot of the tariff defense is, see, it's not so bad. Well, great. It's still not good. It's just not catastrophic.
It's also so premature for them to be claiming that, right?
Yeah. There's also a big risk with this type of victory laps, because I do think markets are a little too optimistic right now about all of this. There is this kind of taco mentality. Trump always chickens out, is problematic. One, because I don't think Trump does always taco. But second, there is, I've called it the taco trilemma, or the taco paradox. And that is that Trump only backs down when markets tank, but markets aren't tanking because they expect Trump to back down. But if markets don't tank, Trump's not going to back down. So we could end up in a situation, and I think we will end up in a situation this fall with very high tariffs, historically high, 20%, 18% on average. That would be the highest since the early 20th century. It would be extremely significant for not just prices, but for growth and investment. That's not good. It's just not exactly clear how it's going to be reflected in, like, the S&P, right? It's still just not, it's not going to be good.
Yeah, I mean, I do, as we bring the conversation to a close, I do want to bring up the kind of underlying promise of tariffs, which is really about bringing back manufacturing to America. That's what economic nationalism is all about. It's about securing critical supply chains, reinvigorating manufacturing.
That's what they say it's about. Yes.
Yeah, well, that's what they say. And maybe there's more to it that you can talk about here. But you're a skeptic of even that story, to say the least. You flag in one of your articles about it this graph, which is the ISM manufacturing index by component contribution. And you see a downward slope. Perhaps you could explain what this is and why it leads you to be kind of skeptical of the economic nationalist story about onshoring.
Right. So, the economic nationalist story, again, to the extent you buy it, is one that maybe made sense in the late 19th century, back when we had tariffs on wool and pig iron and industry, and there wasn't a lot of trade. There weren't a lot of countries engaging in cross-border trade, and supply chains were pretty simple and products were pretty simple. Today, however, it's just a radically different world. There are three numbers I like to throw around when I talk about this stuff. The first is 50%. So about half of everything we import into the United States isn't clothes and shoes, it's manufacturing inputs. Steel, aluminum, raw materials, energy, the rest. So these are things that other manufacturers use to make globally competitive stuff. Tariffs will raise the costs for these manufacturers and make them less competitive globally. So a lot of manufacturers, when you increase tariffs, they are actually more harmed than helped. That's kind of counterintuitive, but it's true. The second one is 33. 1/3 of all global trade is companies trading with themselves, what we call intra-firm trade. So Airbus in the Sun Belt in the Carolinas in the South is not trading with some random company in France. It's buying from Airbus in France. Now, what does that mean? It means that supply chains won't just move to the United States overnight. Airbus is headquartered in France and has operations all over the world and has a very complicated supply chain. So what is a tariff going to do in that case? It's just going to raise the costs of manufacturing in the United States for companies that engage in this intra-firm trade. I saw another stat recently along the same lines, looking at the NAFTA trade, so Canada, Mexico, United States, and the intra-firm numbers in that case were way higher than 1/3. So tariffs are just going to blow up these companies' trade with themselves, right? And by bringing stuff back, you're not actually forcing these companies to go buy from, the auto parts store down the street. You're forcing them to literally reinvent their own supply chains, which is extremely costly if they're willing to do it at all instead of just paying the tariff. And then the last number is 80. 80% of all manufacturing workers in the United States work at companies that are engaged in global trade, imports and exports. So these are all people that at some level are actually hurt by tariffs and retaliation and the currency effects and all that kind of stuff. So you put it all together, along with the fact that the United States is a big player in the global economy, but these days it's one of many. And there are rival trade blocs in Europe and in Asia and Latin America. And the reality is that simply slapping tariffs on stuff does not in any way guarantee a giant and thriving manufacturing sector. And then you throw in all of the uncertainty surrounding all this stuff, right? With a tariff switch in the Oval Office, you have no idea what Trump's going to do next. Trade policy uncertainty is at its highest level ever, 3 times higher than it was during Trump 1.0. And that was found to reduce investment because, it's hard to invest when you don't know what's coming next. Trump 1.0 uncertainty reduced investment in the United States by between $20 and $40 billion. So if we're 3 times as high today, we should expect more foregone investment, including in manufacturing. You put it all together and it's just not a recipe for creating a big, thriving, resilient domestic manufacturing sector. It'll be good for some. The steel industry, they're making out like bandits. Nucor's raised prices like 35%. That's the biggest steel maker in the United States. They've raised prices 35% over the last year. They're profit taking like crazy. Good on you, right? For everybody who buys from Nucor, it sucks. And then, of course, for us consumers, we're going to feel some pain too. None of that is good for the manufacturing sector. And I should note, you're seeing some signs. Trump likes to brag about all this investment that's coming into the United States. We're seeing signs of some multinational manufacturers actually moving out of the United States. They say, look, the environment's too uncertain. There's too much tariff cost, and then I might get hit by retaliation. Screw it. I'm moving to Canada. I'm moving to Europe, wherever. And again, none of that is good for the U.S. manufacturing sector.
My favorite podcast, Autolots, has spent a lot of time interviewing American manufacturers and people looking to beef up their manufacturing capacity here. And one thing that you hear consistently from people, regardless of whether they consider themselves Republican or Democrat fans of Trump or opponents, is they just say, look, if he actually knew how our factories worked or how long it takes to retrofit a factory, to go from one purpose to another, to make one widget and transition to making another, we simply need lead time, and we need the ability to import an awful lot of things, steel and raw materials, in order to do that. And so the fact that this is hitting us so suddenly, and the fact that it's ever changing, makes it so that if his goal was actually to ramp up American manufacturing, boy, do we feel like very crippled. Do we feel like we can't actually accomplish that objective, even though we want to? It would take us 2 years, 3 years of lead time to actually be able to do that effectively. And in the meantime, we would need a lot of these tariffs suspended. He's acting like it will all just happen overnight, and that's not how our industry actually works. Do you have concerns about that? Like, even putting aside the question of like, is it a laudable goal to increase domestic manufacturing? Like, are there just real logistical problems that these people are running into?
Yeah, some of the more honest national conservatives and economic nationalists out there will be quite clear that while they like tariffs and they like protectionism, they do not like how these tariffs have been implemented. Not only has it been very erratic, but it's been completely opaque. And it has not given producers the lead times they need to make the investments that they could make to onshore production. So it's kind of the worst of all worlds in the sense that they're eating the tariffs, which mean unless they can pass them on to consumers, that actually means less hiring and investment here, because they're basically eating these higher tariff costs, and they don't really have the certainty they need to make these massive multi-year investments. I mean, building an auto factory, you can't do it overnight. It's going to take you a couple years at best. Qualifying new suppliers throughout these multi-tier supply chains takes a lot of time, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere. And if in the meantime, you're just eating tariff costs or reducing your output because you don't have the supplies you need, that's all bad for business too. So, I could steelman a protectionist plan that would minimize that kind of damage. I still think it's dumb, but it's less dumb than what we got.
Let me ask you, as my final question for you is, since we're trying to learn, or I guess as a society, we're trying to learn or maybe relearn certain lessons, economic lessons, and that requires paying attention to what actually happens. Like, we're running an economic experiment right now, and unfortunately we're the guinea pigs, but at least hopefully we could learn something from this. So what should people be on the lookout for? Let's say that August 1st, tariffs increase in Europe. I mean, I'm not going to say we can't predict the exact levels they're going to hit, but they increase in Europe, they increase in Mexico, they increase in Brazil and China. What are some of the effects that you would expect us to see if that happens?
Well, I mean, I think the place you start is looking at economic growth, because while CPI can get tricky and real incomes can get tricky, you're not going to be able to hide from the growth stuff. And, if you look at the estimates that are out there, it's that the tariffs are going to completely offset any of the tailwinds that the Trump agenda has otherwise maybe given the economy. So whether it is deregulatory stuff or tax reform or whatever, the tariffs are basically going to make it a wash. So, if we're a couple of years into this and we're just hanging out at 1.5% GDP growth, it's a pretty good sign that things are not going well for this experiment. The other area, I do think, eventually real incomes, right? So real incomes are what you take home, but also what you spend, and including then also into the disposable income. Are we actually worse off in that regard? That's hard to parse out. It's hard to find causation for tariffs, but those are the places I think to look. And then the last one, is eventually we're going to have some pretty good economic studies of all of this stuff. One of the silver linings of Trump 1.0 is we got a lot of new economics literature showing us how tariffs ripple through an economy, how they ripple through modern supply chains, which is something we really hadn't seen before. Turns out, maybe unsurprisingly, but still important, that global supply chains, for all their coolness and complexity and how great they are, when tariffs get involved, supply chains can amplify the pain of tariffs and make them worse than what you might expect in a kind of a more binary, linear model. So those are the types of things that we're going to eventually see, but that's going to take a while to suss out. The immediate signs are going to be, again, in things like the GDP numbers.
Sort of a related question, but this is one we ask to everybody who comes on our show. Scott Lincicome, what is one question that you think more people should be asking?
About trade or just in general?
Can be anything. I mean, you kind of just gave people a really useful template to assess warning signs that might emerge, but you could continue riffing on that, or you could ask life questions.
Whatever you want.
Man, this is such an opportunity. I'm at a loss. No, I think beyond the stuff I already said, one of the things that I think is really important when you talk about trade is to talk about everything else that's going, so not trade. And I think the question I think we should ask is how much of what we blame on trade policies, job losses and other things, is actually the result of other economic forces. Automation, when we talk about jobs, interstate trade. I'm actually writing a paper on that. Interstate trade dwarfs international trade. And yet we never talk about the jobs that Michigan lost to South Carolina. And even though it's a huge issue and one that's gone on through the history of the country, dating back to the beginning. And so I think those are the types of things, what tax and labor and regulatory policy and all these things, they all get blamed on China and globalization. And I think we should be asking a lot more about, well, what are the main drivers of these things that we don't like in the US economy, and how much is it really about trade? And therefore, how much can tariffs really do to change it, even in the best case?
It's funny that you should say that nobody talks about interstate trade and competition, because we, in fact, had an episode with Gary Winslet on this exact topic and this question of like which states are competing with others and pulling, capable workers away, and which states are really trying to make themselves as attractive as possible. And he's also really frustrated that people just don't pay as much attention to this dynamic, when in reality, like, we see the sort of rise of the Sun Belt, and there's a lot of attention paid to that narrative, but it also affects real people's lives and decisions. So
Yeah, for sure.
I totally agree with you.
I've worked with Gary on both trade and interstate stuff before. And so it's his piece in the Washington Post was great. And that's something, again, I think that that is an essential issue, this interstate commerce issue, not just for understanding the U.S. economy, but also talking about trade policy, right? And one reason for that is that Americans intuitively get the benefits of trading across state borders. But when you change it to a national border, suddenly everybody freaks out, and the principles, the economic principles change. Now, we can have arguments about culture and all that kind of stuff, but the economics are the same. And yet the script flips entirely when people think about interstate versus international trade issues. And again, it's also important because it is so much bigger than the international stuff. Some of the research I'm doing right now shows that just trade in goods by our highways is in the $20 trillion a year range, whereas we only import a mere $4 trillion a year in imports, right? So, like, we should be talking more about this stuff, and yet we don't much at all, other than your podcast.
No, it's fascinating, and we'll be watching for that research, and hopefully can have you come back to talk about it once it's published. Sure. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Scott Lincicome, and you can find his work at Cato and the Dispatch, and he has a great Twitter account as well. So follow him there.
Do. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks.